Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Well, we're not focusing in on one event today so much as a season. January of the fourth year of an outgoing president's term, the final weeks of the so-called lame duck presidency. It is also known as pardoning season. At least that's what we're calling it. You're no doubt familiar with the rush of pardons in the final weeks of an administration. You get these press releases announcing that the criminal sentences have been overturned or reduced for all sorts of people. We'll get into the difference between a pardon and a commutation, but the gist of it is that the president has the constitutional power to say you are off the hook. We've touched on a few pardons over the years on this show. George Washington pardoned the folks who took part in the so-called Whiskey Rebellion. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. Jimmy Carter pardoned people who had evaded the Vietnam War draft. Sometimes these are used for righteous reasons to overturn miscarriages of justice. And a lot of times it seems like there's this last chance for a president to, for lack of a better term, do some favors. So let's talk about presidential pardons since we are about to enter Joe Biden pardon season. We kind of already have started it. And we'll do some history, and then we will hear about a particular case that is the subject of a podcast series in which the people at the heart of it are seeking a pardon from Biden sometime between now and when he leaves office on January 20th. So first, here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. I want to propose that we call pardon season uncuffing season.
Uncuffing season. Very good. Amazing. Got it. Kellie?
Hey there, guys.
And our guest for this episode is Shannon Lynch, who's a podcast producer and host at the New America Foundation and is the person behind New America's new podcast series called The Alley, DC's 8th and H case. Shannon, welcome to the show. Thanks for doing this and congrats on the new podcast series.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So we'll get into it, but The Alley, your series, focuses on a 1984 murder in Washington, D.C., in which 8 young men were sentenced to life in prison. Evidence now shows that they were innocent, and the 6 living men have been released, but they are seeking a presidential pardon to fully clear their names. We'll get to that. We'll go deep on that and actually talk about how people can help out with that case. But let's do a little history here, Shannon. We're going to rope you into a little background. Kellie, I said it. It's worth clarifying. This is in the Constitution. It's where it all starts.
It is. Article 2, Section 2. Presidents have the power to pardon or give commutations to people who they see fit, with the exception of impeachment. So if you've been impeached.
But that'll never come up, right?
You're exempt from that. But yeah, pardons have been around since the founding of this country. Alexander Hamilton is sort of credited with having created this idea to give the president a little bit more influence when it comes to sort of big of cases and people who might need it. And actually, George Washington is obviously the first president to use it when he pardons people who participated in the 1795 Whiskey Rebellion.
Yeah.
I think that the Hamilton angle is actually kind of interesting because pardon power was something that kings had. And Hamilton, who was probably the most pro-monarchy of the founders, it is unsurprising, I think, that he was the one who really pushed for not just like a presidential pardon power, but a presidential pardon power that had no congressional oversight. So it really would be what the president decides will be the who gets pardoned or commuted.
Mm-hmm. Shannon, when you were doing this piece, and obviously you tell the history of this case, but then it results in this moment that we're in right now where these men are seeking a pardon. Did you come to understand the kind of power that a president yields or notice any trends about how these pardons get issued and to whom over the years?
Yes, absolutely. I would say that over the past 20, 25 years or so, we have seen a trend towards pardons being used as kind of political favors in more instances than it had in the past. And the unfortunate reality with that is that if you don't have a lot of money or a lot of political influence, then you are less likely to be pardoned. And that's kind of what we're trying to address here with this group of men with, increasing public pressure because they don't happen to have connections in the White House or they don't happen to be billionaires, but nonetheless, they deserve a pardon because of their claims of actual innocence.
Yeah. I also see the big problem with the trend toward what feel like kind of like self-dealing pardons, certainly starting with the Iran-Contra pardons in 92 by George H.W. Bush, is that it makes people suspicious of the pardon power. And what I love about the story that you're telling, and even some of the pardons that we saw under Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Jimmy Carter and other presidents, is that the pardon power can be used to right injustices. And I think we can lose sight of that when we're so focused on what feels like a corruption of the pardon power.
Yeah, like with Nixon and Ford.
Yeah.
I mean...
Right. Though, I mean, look, I'm sure we have historians out there who this is their world and they're sort of, will write us notes and point out how complicated all this is. But I do feel like if you take a sort of sweep of the use of this power, it does feel like, generally speaking, in the first century and a half of this country's history, it was often used in this way of like, we need to get past a fracture. It's the greater good, right? And so pardoning people who were part of a rebellion, or pardoning, even Andrew Johnson pardoning Jefferson Davis, who's the former president of the Confederacy. James Buchanan used the power to bargain with the Mormons and offered a blanket pardon in order to then get some U.S. sovereignty. I mean, it's just sort of like, we're building this nation, we're trying to hold this nation together. Here are things that, at least in the logic of the moment, feel like, there's a greater good here.
Except with, I think, with Andrew Johnson. I mean, like, this is maybe where it comes in, the difference between the pardon and a commutation, because a pardon basically erases all guilt. You are forgiven, and it's almost as though the crime or the incident never happened. But when it comes to a commutation, you get a reduction in your sentence. So maybe you were on death row and now it's life in parole, or maybe you had, or a life in prison, I should say, or maybe you had life in prison and now you're getting out early because you're 85 and can do no harm. Like, there are ways in which people get these pardons or commutations, but I think who gets what is also really political. Like, a pardon means more than a commutation.
I gotta say, this is like the big idea I've sort of been noodling with, and then Shannon, we will get to like the eighth and H case. But like, we talked about how this was sort of a power that was often seen as part of a king, and how it was Hamilton who was sort of very imperially aligned who brought this in. But like, to me, this is one of the clear places where like someone like Donald Trump can look at the U.S. presidency and be like, oh yeah, like they have the power to pardon people. Like, it is effectively, a monarchy. Like, I can get in there and do what I want. Not that Donald Trump would need tons of excuses in order to sort of have that impulse or indulge that impulse. But this has always struck me as one of those places where like people who believe in sort of, authoritarianism can say like, well, why do we give this person this kind of power? Doesn't that say something about the nature of the office? So I don't know. It's always struck me as a little strange. And then more specifically, Shannon, and this maybe we can start to fold in the eighth and H case, but like embedded in the pardon question is, I think, this idea that there was a miscarriage of justice, and that like the justice system itself is not going to be the thing that's going to unwind the miscarriage or the mistake or whatever you want to call it. And so what does that say about how broken things are, that the only intervention comes using this power?
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting because, most of American history, this process has pretty much gone unchecked as far as any oversight from any other branch of or any other entity of government. But in 1981, the Office of the Pardon Attorney was formed, which formalized the process a little bit more, in that an application would go through the Justice Department to be approved by the pardon attorney, who would then issue a recommendation whether to pardon or not. But like you said, this is really a power in the sole discretion of the president. He or she can make this decision regardless of what the pardon attorney advises them to do. And in fact, they can pardon anyone at any time for any reason, right, even if they don't apply for one. So, the process has been formalized a little bit in the past 50-ish years, but it's still largely unchecked.
So it doesn't always have to happen in this like rush at the very end of a presidency, right, which I think adds to the kind of like sketchiness of it.
Yeah.
Yes, on my last day in office, I will.
Well, that's what makes it seem like kind of suspect, right? But I wonder, Shannon, if you could tell us about the miscarriage of justice at the heart of this eighth and H case. What what happened both in terms of the crime and in terms of the trial that happened after.
Mm-hmm. So in the 8th and H case, took place in 1984 after the murder of Catherine Fuller, and it led to the arrest of 17 young Black Washingtonians. Detectives really acted on this anonymous tip and kind of formed tunnel vision for this theory that this was the work of a so-called gang. And there was actually no gang activity in the neighborhood at the time, but largely, in my opinion, due to racism by the MPD, they let that guide their assumption that this was the work of a group of young Black kids. What ended up happening is they received or coerced multiple false confessions out of these teenagers, which were later recanted under oath. But by then, the damage was done, which led to this large group of arrests, 17 young Washingtonians being arrested. And there was no physical evidence whatsoever that tied any of the accused to the crime scene. And just before the trial, the prosecutor came across evidence that actually pointed to an alternative perpetrator. And rather than kind of pausing the process at that point in time, he hid that evidence from the defense lawyers. And this was, not recovered until decades later. So what ended up happening with only these false confessions, the sole basis of this case, 8 young men were given life sentences. And 6 of those men are still alive, and those 6 men are currently seeking a pardon.
Folks, I have very good news to deliver right at the top of the new year. That's right, it is 2025 and the great Alex Goldman is back with a new podcast called Hyperfixed right here on Radiotopia. Isn't it nice to get good news to start a new year? You know Alex, right? You know Alex. I've actually known Alex for a long time, going all the way back to when we were at WNYC together. He worked on the media, I worked in the newsroom. He went on to make the legendary and much beloved podcast Reply All, and now all is right with the universe because Alex is back with a new show on Radiotopia. Some things just make sense. So, what is Hyperfixed? Well, it's a show in which Alex and his team try to solve problems for their listeners. No problem too big, no problem too small. What's that mysterious button do? Why do the big coolers at grocery stores not have doors on them? Should I have kids or not? Along the way to answering these questions, Alex takes you on a journey to uncover the hidden systems and rabbit holes that help explain how we got here. And if you know Alex's work, you can rest assured that there is some vintage Goldman grumpiness along the way. Seriously, when we say that Radiotopia is the home for the most original audio makers in the world to try their ambitious new projects, this is what we are talking about. So, help welcome Alex Goldman to Radiotopia. Rejoice in an excellent new show to add to your rotation. It's called Hyperfixed. Hyperfixed. Check it out right now, wherever you get your podcasts. Look, I know it's a bit of a cliche to make a New Year's resolution to save more money. Probably even more of a cliche that resolution rarely gets kept. Honestly, I don't know when you're listening to this, but chances are I have already broken like 4 of my New Year's resolutions. But the saving more money one, it has been a lot easier for me thanks to Mint Mobile. I switched over to Mint Mobile's premium wireless service a couple months ago, and it has put some real wind in my sails going into 2025. Because their plans start at just $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. Switching over from one of the big 3 carriers was incredibly easy, and boom, just like that, saving. I'm on my way. You can be on your way to fulfilling that resolution to spend less. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/thisday. That's mintmobile.com/thisday. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/thisday. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
And And this case made its way to the Supreme Court, right? Because of that violation, because you're not allowed as a prosecutor to hide evidence. If you come across exculpatory evidence, you have to turn it over. So why didn't that evidence that the prosecutor had violated these young men's rights, why didn't that lead to a reversal in their conviction?
That's right. And this was a Brady violation is what it's referred to, because of a rule that the Supreme Court established in the 1960s. And it does say that prosecutors are not supposed to hide evidence that may change the outcome of a trial. However, the reality is prosecutors get away with doing this all the time. And that's because the people that are supposed to be looking over said prosecutor's shoulder are on their team. Especially in instances where, for example, DAs that are elected, they have very strong incentive to win trials, prosecutions. And so they may be less likely to, nudge someone in their office to share evidence that really should be shared. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. With the help of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, who's actually worked on this case for 20 years now. And what the Supreme Court ruled, which in my personal opinion doesn't make sense, they ruled that these false confessions, even though they were recanted later on, outweighed this evidence of this probable alternative perpetrator. And I would love to go into a little bit of that evidence if that's okay.
Sure.
So there was a young man that was seen fleeing the crime scene right after Mrs. Fuller's body was discovered. And he was concealing an object under his coat as he ran away from the scene. And it should be noted that the object that was used to assault Mrs. Fuller was never recovered. And this young man named James McMillan actually had been convicted of several other brutal assaults on women in the same area at the same time, and would actually go on to commit an almost identical murder in an alley a few blocks away from where Mrs. Fuller was killed. So the picture, is pretty clear in my opinion of who actually perpetrated this crime. But when the prosecutor came across this evidence and decided not to share it, because they were so honed in on this gang theory, the Supreme Court decided that these false confessions were more important than the evidence of seeing this other young man at the crime scene at the time.
That's just crazy to me. That you could push aside all of that evidence. I mean, and also it just seems backward in the sense that if you want to win, you would have that by finding this killer and locating the person who actually did it. Is still a win, but it's like it doesn't feel like a win until you throw more people away. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I think by this point, when the prosecutor came across this evidence, it was maybe a month or two before trial was set to begin. So we're talking a year into this investigation. And by this point, there really was this case made publicly that this was the work of a gang of Black kids. Essentially by this point, these kids had already been tried and convicted in the eyes of the media. And so I think, maybe not only did the prosecutor not want to undo all the work he did, but he may have viewed it as it being difficult to persuade a jury after all of this, public persuasion had already been done. At least that's my theory.
Well, it's interesting because public persuasion is kind of the story at the both beginning and at the end of this case, right? It is the thing that led to these people being locked up and then eventually their release, and now this moment we're in right now. But tell us a little bit about how the 6 men eventually become paroled, what they're up to now, and how much kind of media pressure, public persuasion played a role in that.
Yeah. So of the 8 young men that were given life sentences, 6 of them are still alive. They all served out their minimum sentences, which were between 26 and 37 years. The first of them, Chris Turner, was released in 2010 after he served a little over 26 years. And the most recent, Russell Overton, was released in 2022 after serving 37 and a half years. So it's really remarkable, honestly, what these men have done with their lives after being handed this, really impossible hand. They're all working at several points in time. Several of them have worked more than one job. One of them has since gotten married since he's been released. Two of them are currently engaged. They all are very active in community service in the greater DC area. And most incredible to me is their ability to not hold on to this anger or bitterness. I think if I were wrongfully incarcerated for 37 years, I don't know if I would have the wherewithal to still want to help my community, the same community that was partially responsible for putting me away. But they all, somehow have the grace in their hearts to be able to do so.
Obviously, the sort of entry point for us into this story is presidential pardons. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about a kind of technicality. I think listeners over the last few years have learned a lot about what can be pardoned by a president and what can't. And this is not necessarily a federal case, but it falls under the jurisdiction of presidential pardons. Can you explain to us why that is?
That's right. So in most murder cases, if someone is seeking a pardon, they would go to the governor in the state in which the crime took place. In this instance, DC is not a state. It is under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So any murder that happens in DC, in fact, any crime that happens in DC, that individual or individuals would have to apply for a pardon from the president directly.
So I guess because the men are already released, the pardon is not about getting them out of prison. What will the pardon accomplish for them? Other than their innocence, which is no small thing, I want to say. But in terms of technicalities, how will it improve their lives?
Yeah, I've been asked this question a lot. And actually, in the Alley, episode 10 is entirely devoted to answering this question. Why do they need a presidential pardon even though they've been released from prison? And the answer is every single day of their lives continue to be affected by this conviction. Most notably, and the one that people often think of, is their job prospects. There are a lot of jobs that they cannot apply for. And when they do, they're often discriminated against because of their record. Another big thing is their issues and the challenges they face in establishing relationships, whether that be romantic relationships, friendships, making amends with family members. If just imagine every time you meet someone or go on a date, you have to explain to them, I was convicted of murder, but by the way, that didn't actually happen. It severely affects their abilities to be social. Several of them don't really go outside the house other than to go to work, maybe church. The rest of the time, often they're at home. They live more isolated lives than they should because, their inability to trust strangers. Another thing, which actually doesn't apply to former felons in DC, but in the vast majority of places in the country, felons lose their right to vote. And in about half of the states in the country, they continue to be disenfranchised for a certain period of time after coming out. So that's also another important thing to know about why someone might need a pardon even after they've been released from prison.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about where we are now. I mentioned that there's something that actually our listeners can do to help in this case, but to go back to the kind of bigger context we started with about pardons, what is your sense of whether this case is on the Biden administration's radar? What is your sense of how the Biden administration is going about making their decisions regarding who gets pardoned? You talked about how it often seems to come down to the right kind of connections? Do you feel like these men have those? We're talking about 15 days here. We're on the clock, right?
Yes, absolutely. However, part of the reason I'm optimistic is, as we mentioned earlier, especially in recent administrations, a huge amount of pardons happen in the day before or a couple of days before, sometimes even the morning that a president is leaving office. But my sense of where this is at, unfortunately, this process is really like a black box, and there's very little to no public information about where the application might be in the process. With that being said, though, this case has received a good amount of local and national press, and over the coming weeks, we're continuing to pursue that. So I think that the more public attention that is put on it, it'd be more likely to reach the attention of the president. And so in that sense, I think that it's making it more and more likely that the pardons will be granted because of the amount of attention that the case is getting.
And there's a petition as well going?
Yes. So if listeners want to support, they can go to the website 8thandjustice.org. That's the number 8, THAND justice.org. And they can go there and virtually sign a letter of support that is, continuously being updated and sent as supplemental material for their pardon applications. They can also, of course, go and listen to The Alley, DC's 8th and H case, to get a better understanding of the case. And really importantly, talk about this with your friends and family, post about it on social media. Like I said, the more public pressure, the more public awareness of this case, the more likely it is that these pardons will actually happen. So it really is crucial to have the involvement of the public.
Yeah. Well, look, we'll put links to all of that, your series, but also the petition. And I will say the petition page has lots of great information and testimonials on there as well, and is really worth spending some time with. But, look, we're going to see what happens with these pardons. And you look at the history of pardons, and, for every mega donor like Mark Rich who gets a favor called in by the Clintons, or for Steve Bannon and Lil Wayne who got pardoned by Trump, for every example like that, about which I think you can be pretty cynical, there are other moments like this where I think that power can really be used to address a wrong. And so we will see what happens. But Shannon, thanks for doing this. Thanks for reaching out to us and suggesting that we do this conversation. We're really happy we were able to put it together. Thank you, Shannon Lynch of the New America Foundation. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Nicole Hammer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.